So again, my name is Brian Swets. I'm with the City of Portsmouth. I'm the comp plan manager there. We updated our comp plan. It was adopted 3.5 years ago now. Wow, time flies. Build One Portsmouth. So I'm going to talk about how we deliberately use resiliency in our comprehensive plan. The agenda for today, I wasn't exactly sure who was going to be here, so I'm kind of splitting time. The first half will be a little bit more of the philosophical thinking of resiliency in comprehensive planning. And the second half, I'll talk more about specific examples of what we've done in Portsmouth and finish up by talking about some next steps. Okay, so the first thing, and for those of you who have heard me speak before, I always start with the same thing, which is you need to know what your goals are. You need to know before you begin anything, what is it that you want to achieve? The point can't just be to talk about resilience or to have resilience included as a buzzword. You need to know why you want to be resilient. You need to know what you hope that resilience can accomplish for you and for your locality. And the way to do that, at least the way that I chose to do that, was to do a lot of research at a time. I went looking through comprehensive plans, sustainability plans, resiliency plans for those that existed, housing plans, any number of plans from other cities, localities, areas, PDCs, whoever, to kind of get a feel for what people were doing and what it might look like, and to cherry pick the things that I thought were best from those plans to get an idea of, to help inform kind of where I was going. Once we had an idea of where we were going and we were in agreement as a department that this is what we wanted to do, we did use a consultant for this. So we wrote in the RFP very specifically that resilience was going to be an important consideration. It was something that should be imbued throughout the comprehensive plan and not just as a standalone chapter. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is later, but we said that up front. We asked for examples for people who were submitting of what kind of work they had done that included things like resiliency. We asked follow-up questions in the interviews to get a better feel for what they had actually done and what the people on the team had actually done, as opposed to what maybe the firm at large had done. And we included it in our scoring. So we had an idea of where we wanted to go, and we bent our process to make sure that that was included, and we gave significant weight to it when we made our selections. This is kind of a flow chart for that thought process. This would be for completing discrete steps, like say writing a comp plan or building a widget. But when you're planning to do this, you're thinking almost backwards in a way. You start with your goals, you develop your strategies to achieve those goals, and then you have individual tactics or projects that you implement in order to achieve those goals. It's kind of backwards from the way that we think about when we're implementing a project, where you start with a tactic or an individual action, and that feeds into a broader strategy, and then at the end, when you complete it, hopefully you have achieved some sort of goals. Now, what these things have in common is that you have to measure throughout the entire process. You need to make sure that what you're doing is something that is verifiable and it's data driven. This is a broader diagram that I think is helpful, at least for me, when I think about resilience as a process, as a system as a whole, as opposed to for individual actions. It just demonstrates that this is a system. It's constantly informing itself through actions and through measurements. And as we do things and as we learn, and then as we make adjustments and we change our plans, and again, we measure and we implement and we learn, it's all a never-ending cycle, and that can be frustrating. It makes you feel a little bit like Sisyphus. And you start to go through all of this work and these tasks, and you realize that resiliency is not a destination; it's a journey. Even when you get to the end of something, you realize that you still have to keep going. And all that begs the question: well, what is resiliency? And it's going to be different for different localities, for different cities, for different states, whoever it is that's thinking about it. In this area in Hampton Roads, we think a lot about flooding, for example. This is a picture in downtown Portsmouth of actual flooding. Couldn't figure out what happened to the car. Like, if you're the guy driving that Mustang and your car floods, did you have to pop the hood. I mean, couldn't you look outside and figure out what it was that was damage to your car? But this is also kind of scary when you see how far up in the buildings the flooding is, or that you have an ambulance in the back that is flooded out. Actually, this is a good anecdote for a little resilience project. Things that we talk about. I'll talk about the other slide, but on these light posts here at this intersection, because flooding is so bad, you'll actually see red, white, and blue reflective tape. And that's there specifically for heights for the city's emergency vehicles to tell them if they can or can get not get through an intersection. I don't know if it's because of this specific example, but it is kind of funny when you're out there to see something like that. Not so funny when you're the fire department and you lost a $500,000 truck. Okay, resiliency isn't just flooding though. It's not just environmental, even though that's the context we think about it a lot in this area. It's broader than that. For example, economic diversity. I think of a petro state, that's reliant on a single natural resource like oil. You see a lot more unrest. They're not able to weather downturns as well, whereas a more resilient economy, which has multiple sectors that's investing in, is able to come through a hazard a whole lot better. Portsmouth is a good example of this. While we are not a rich city, we are actually pretty well economically diversified. And so we came through the pandemic pretty well. We did a lot better coming through the pandemic than we did something like sequestration, for example, when we saw a reduction in military spending. That was actually something. It was, I've been saying this for a little while. It was kind of nice to see that borne out when we went through the budget this year, that the city was able to come through okay because we did have a more diverse economy, something we've been pushing in our comp plan. Because what happens if some strange event comes along and all of a sudden all your prime activity centers become ghost towns because everyone has had to go virtual, which I know seems crazy, right? Except we're living through it. Or maybe you've been transported to some apocalyptic future where everyone is fighting over a limited resource. Matt, it's a good excuse to just put a gif of Mad Max in here, but at the same time, it's also a nice allegory for climate change. The point is that every locality, every city, every whoever that is trying to become more resilient needs to understand its own unique shocks and stressors in their system. And then you adapt the principles of resiliency to fit your specific needs. It's not the other way around. It's not just you force resiliency on things. You need to understand what you're trying to integrate it into. So you've identified your goals and you've identified your unique shocks and stressors. And now you can begin. Hey, congratulations. The first step, once you actually begin, is figuring out where are you now. In order to do that, you can't guess. You need to measure, because again, resiliency needs to be data driven. When resiliency is not data driven, you get an imbecile standing in the United States Senate saying that climate change is a hoax because snowballs. While we can't fix stupid by being resilient, we can use data to refute these kind of idiotic arguments on one hand and to better inform policy decisions on the other. And admittedly, that's a much harder process. It's a lot easier to just invent your reality out of whole cloth and just decide that that's where it is that you want to live and that's what you want to talk about. But when we take the time to measure the data and we take the time to put it in context, we make our pronouncements, we make our policies and regulations and our plans more measurable and more justifiable. And when we do that, then our policy becomes much more legitimate and therefore becomes more resilient. We've all had, at least we all know of, experiences where maybe a city didn't want to do something or a department wasn't sure that this is the step that they should take. But afterwards, once you were able to convince the powers that be that this is something we should do, and then you begin measuring the progress, and you measure your outcomes, and then you can come back and you can say, see, this saved us X amount of dollars, or it saved Y amount of travel time. When we can do things like that, that's how policies and regulations become sticky. That's how they don't go away, because you have shown that they work. A really good example for those who are unaware of doing the data collection and the analysis first before jumping headlong into trying to just get straight to implementation is Virginia Beach. They spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of staff effort in doing this analysis of historical and future heavy precipitation. For those of you who haven't seen this, the the data itself, while it's interesting, is not the point. It's the thinking that went into the to starting something like this. And I would highly recommend, excuse me, that people go check this out. Um, Most places don't have the money that Virginia Beach does to pour into something like this, but what you see is how well it informs where they're going, and it allows them to do things like uh, change the benchmark storm levels, for example. Something that we talk about all the time, like, oh, a 20-year storm is more like a 5-year storm now. But when you actually have the data to back it up, then you can go and you can change your policies and your procedures internally, and then those hold up in court when you inevitably get sued, as the beach was, and for not allowing a subdivision in an area that floods. But you've done the work, so you're not capricious and arbitrary anymore. And so that's a good place to be. And I applaud Virginia Beach for the dedication they put into that. It's also important to recognize that leadership matters. Leaders matter. Whether we like light rail or you don't like light rail, whatever it is, we have to admit that it couldn't have happened without Norfolk Councilman Randy Wright. He made the impossible possible because he was dedicated, he was patient, and he persisted. He expressed ideas on policy that he wanted to achieve. He followed up with staff. Made sure that people understood that it was a priority, and he kept talking about it. And at the end, he ended up helping the city accomplish something that I don't think people would have thought could have been accomplished when he first started talking about it. And see, this is a good example of remembering that resiliency is a long-term process. It's a way of thinking, and it doesn't really end. Even when light rail was built, there was still constant thinking about how is it that we make it better. And they do that by looking at data. Well, ridership isn't where we want, so how do we improve ridership? You have to keep thinking these things through in order to be able to make sure that you have good policy. Remember Sisyphus. Okay, so that's the kind of philosophical part of things. Now I want to get into specific examples of what we did in Portsmouth. This was data that we used to inform the comp plan. This has to do with street flooding. These are from surveys that we did with the Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center. The closer to green you get, the higher the frequency of street flooding was. And so you can see it as a pretty clear line, almost looks like a straight line across the city going from northeast to southwest. That's Interstate 264. So it's almost like on one side of the tracks, flooding is much worse than the other. Excuse me. This, for those who live in the area, it seems obvious because we know from driving or living or working or whatever that these are areas that flood, but you still have to have that data to back up what it is that you think Once we have that data, then we use that to inform a comp plan and to inform our goals and our strategies. We use it to inform regional plans like the joint land use study that we're doing right now. And this better solidifies our case. So when we go and apply for grants and other sources of funding, we can point back to this baseline data and say, see here, we've measured the problem, and here's the problem that we're trying to solve. Another example is green corridors. We talk a lot in the area about preserving habitat or increasing canopy coverage, but it needs to serve a broader purpose. And the PDC looked at this in creating these green corridors. And so we've taken that idea and incorporated it into the comp plan so that when we say that we want to increase habitat, we have a way of prioritizing where it is that it should go so that our limited dollars become more meaningful. I mentioned our diversified economy. This is the employment by industry in Portsmouth in 2017. You can see that the largest total is federal government. That's because of the presence of Norfolk Naval Shipyard and the Naval Hospital, Federal Coast Guard facilities, the weapons depot. So while there is a ton of federal spending, and while sequestration did hurt, the government more or less is going to be pretty steady in its funding, and so that helps keep our limited budget balanced, more or less the same as we go through every year. Again, this is why we came through the pandemic so much better. It's also a good example of why economic development departments should be looking to expand smaller sectors to balance out their large kind of static employers, because one, I imagine give a lot less money to developers who don't need it, but instead you find yourself investing in development. I'm going to talk about that again a little bit more later. We also need to focus on development being equitable. We need to balance both what's good for industry with what's good for people. In our Portsmouth comp plan, we talked specifically about paying living wages. We talked about incentivizing local businesses, especially women and minority-owned businesses. But we also talked about removing needless regulations, reassessing processes to reduce wait time so that you reduce, whether the fear that something won't be able to be developed in your city. The point is that, again, this takes time. What's the first bar in the pyramid here? Early exposure and socialization, kind of the investing in kids, education. It takes a while when you want to make something more resilient, and the economy is a good example of that. But if you truly want this to work out, you do have to do the work at the beginning of laying the groundwork in order to be able to reach that wealth and job creation pinnacle at the top, like you see there. Excuse me. Another example where we want to be more resilient was housing. It's a popular idea in this area to raise homes. Some of you will remember Dave Hansen, the former Virginia Beach city manager, standing up in the PDC and saying that, hey, our plan as a region should be to go to FEMA and tell them that we need to completely redo your grant application processes, because the only thing we should be doing is raising houses. And he literally said, because people will be fine just staying at home for 3 or 4 days, and you cook on your grill and you're up above the floodwaters, and then they go away and we'll be fine again. That's not a resilient way of thinking about how to handle flooding. Raising your house is more resilient in the short term, but is this resilient over the long term? Are we talking about also raising roads and raising the infrastructure that we need to serve that housing or to serve commuters trying to get to work? What we thought about in the comp plan was, instead of focusing on buyouts and house raising, we need to be focusing on putting density in areas that are not subject to recurrent flooding. And we did that by not just using FEMA flood maps, but by using dedicated modeling data that we did with VIMS, where we used historical storms and we added on sea level rise, and we said, what is this going to look like in the future? And so we can use that data to then try to inform our land use decisions about the best place to put things. We also need, when we talk about housing, we need to think about the work of making a home itself a lot more sustainable and resilient. We need to be focusing on green buildings, on energy conservation, better insulation, low emissions, reducing waste, and including recyclables into the materials that we use. Even if the design of this house, to me, is terrible, the thinking that goes into it and the components that go into it are much more resilient. Wind energy, renewable sources of energy, these are going to be huge. Dominion's building their wind turbines off of Virginia Beach. Our comp plan talks about how we need to scale that down at the residential level and make it easier for people to implement those kinds of solutions on their own properties. Infrastructure is something else we talk a lot about, making it more resilient. This is an example of hopefully a future stormwater park in our downtown area. This is a local project, would serve as a local BMP that would encourage more dense development. It incentivizes development as opposed to incentivizing the developer, because it's something that, if you want to say build a new apartment building, now you don't have to build a BMP on site. The city has already provided one for you. It's an amenity for downtown residents. It serves as flood control, as it captures stormwater. It leads to water quality improvements. It removes impervious surface and adds canopy coverage. Basically, it's capturing a whole bunch of resilient ideas all into one project. This park is in the design phase now. We've been using funding from our CIP and also from the Chesapeake Bay Trust, a grant program they have called Green Streets, Green Jobs, and Green Towns. And I am very, very hopeful that this is the type of thing that will really help to continue the revitalization of downtown Portsmouth as we seek to attract more people down there. But on the other hand, downtown Portsmouth does flood. I showed the picture back at the beginning of the slide. And one thing that we've wondered about is flood proofing non-residential buildings. We have a number of businesses that keep sandbags next to their front doors so that they can sandbag their businesses when we get those high intensity summer thunderstorms or we get nor'easters. But that's not really a resilient way to think about protecting, what's the heart of our non-military economy in Portsmouth. So we need to think about, because we haven't really been doing this, what is our goal? What are we trying to achieve? And this just isn't just Portsmouth, it's the region. Are we trying to prevent flooding? Are we trying to mitigate flooding? I always come back to the work that Hampton did when they, have done their in-depth flooding analysis in two different neighborhoods. And when talking to people, you have one neighborhood where the people have grown up with water and living on the water and they're used to water, and so they're okay with water, whereas the other community is not, and they don't want to ever get their feet wet. And these are two very different ways of approaching the problem. And when we think about it like that, it makes it much harder for us to figure out, well, then what is going to be the solution? If we're doing individual floodproofing projects on businesses, for example, is that going to drive away foot traffic? If you have to put a metal sheet up over your door, what is that going to look like? Where does it go when it's not flooded? These are things that we need to think about as we're trying to improve and increase economic activity in our downtown. We also made sure to include the idea of equity into our resilient thinking, and with full respect and credence given to the needed ongoing fights for racial justice, I don't think there's a greater example of inequity than the coming environmental catastrophe that we're unleashing on our children and grandkids. Most of our decision making at this point is in the short term, and while that benefits us, it doesn't help our youth. And so our comp plan explicitly states that climate change is real, that's happening, and then it lays out broader strategies for fighting to limit the impacts of climate change. For example, we talk about the need to fight for environmental and social justice. A lot of what we think about is things like land use and air pollution, and this is a good example of two completely and totally incompatible land uses, very, very close to, if not adjacent to each other. But we also think about this at a smaller level so last year we had an application for a car wash on a traditional corner out parcel lot, which is next to a new public housing project. And we recommended denial, and Planning Commission recommended denial of the project, and the project went away. And we did that specifically because of the idea of equity. We said, would you want a car wash next to your house if you lived in a nicer residential neighborhood like Old Town? Do you want that noise? Do you want that the ugly aesthetic right next to where you live, especially after you poured a bunch of money into building a new development? I don't think that this would have happened a couple years ago without the protests that we've seen, but it's a good example of why it's important to be thinking about equity. Another example is food and service deserts. This is Wendell Pierce, aka Bunk Moreland from The Wire. Some other woman. Wendell started a co-op grocery store in New Orleans because there was a massive food desert, and he wanted to help in his community. Now, unfortunately, it did close a year later, but I applaud him for attempting, but two, the development team behind it has learned, and now they're attempting to start and build other grocery stores in other neighborhoods based on what it was that they've learned, the data that they've gathered, the experiences that they've had in trying to build this grocery store. This is important because we do have a lot of these food deserts in Hampton Roads, places where people can't get to a grocery store and access fresh food. And so we need to be making sure that we have policies in place that allow grocery stores and incentives to get grocery stores into these areas. Mobility and access are equity issues. This, if you can believe it, is actually a neighborhood in DC. I can't believe that there's a neighborhood in DC that looks like Chesapeake, but they didn't have sidewalks. And people were arguing that we would rather walk in the street than we would have sidewalks installed. This is a thought process I can't wrap my mind around, but this is not good for kids. It's not good for the elderly. It's not good for the handicapped or people with other mobility disabilities. This is something that we need to have in our policies and our plans, that we're building sidewalks and that we're making sure that everywhere is accessible to all people. We are going to be attempting to do more of this on our High Street corridor, where we've instituted a complete streets policy in our upcoming bike and ped plan. It came out of our comp plan. This graphic is actually from the comp plan. It's being revised right now to get it more operational as we build out what we're calling our new innovation district. But the idea again comes from the comp plan. It started there, and now we're seeing stuff filter into our everyday life in city government. And it's really good to see.